I think case studies can serve as a tool to enhance abductive reasoning. And what do I mean by that? Abductive reasoning is something that we employ regularly as counselors in the room with clients all the time. And it's different from inductive and deductive reasoning. With adductive reasoning, you can think of like Goldilocks and the Three Bears. She walks into this room and sees the table and sees the porridge, and there's steam rising up from it. And she's able to abductively reason that the bears just left, right? And so from an observation, you can abduce that there's some sort of explanation. Now, we work with very, very complex cases with complex people. It's not so simple as porridge and bears. But what we use as a skill is an ability to, in the room in real time, abductively infer the best possible explanation, maybe based on a theoretical framing or whatnot, for what's going on for a client. And so when I see my students at work, many of the very best of them are non-traditional students. And I would argue that the reason for that is because they have more life experience. And with more life experience, we are expanding our pot, if you will, of abductive reasoning skill. We could also call it wisdom. I think that case studies are a opportunity, or provide an opportunity, a tool to enhance abductive reasoning by giving us examples outside of our immediate lived experience. When we read about a story of a client with a counselor, we are able to add that knowledge of the nuance and the detail and the description to our understanding of what is happening for clients, and we can apply that in the future. And so I think that clinical case studies, in particular empirical as well, which we'll talk about, provide us an opportunity to enhance or further support our ongoing development in our abductive reasoning and make us, in the end, more effective counselors.
If we look historically back at the helping fields, case studies were used, have been used since the beginning of helpers, right? Like I think the medical field does an excellent job when they have an exemplary case that they work through of writing that up so their colleagues can see that. And that is kind of what the foundations of what was kind of neuroscience morphed into psychiatry, morphed into psychology, morphed into all the other helping fields that have branched from that, did a really excellent job of saying, we have something that we have never seen here before. We need to write about it. And I think that there is some kind of a dark side of that history of potentially some exploitation of clients kind of early in the use of case studies, using people on stages or having people as kind of live demonstrations of their symptoms in front of other educators. But I think that there's a way in kind of contemporary times that we can still take our kind of unique client cases or maybe even exemplary client cases and make sure that we are have a lot of care and empathy and our ethics wrapped around that to be able to capture that and make sure that other people in our field can see the same thing we are seeing behind the doors of our counseling offices. And so I think we have history to stand on here. And I think that we have some really excellent contemporary practices to protect our clients in a better way now to be able to communicate out what we're seeing in our counseling rooms.
Clinical state case studies tend to focus more on clinical outcomes for clients. Clinical case studies tend to be more common in counseling magazines. They focus more on descriptive accuracy and clinical outcomes for individual cases. This can include group cases as well, but most of the times it's more common to see it in an individual client case. Clinical case studies will tend to illustrate the counseling process. They provide detailed examples of the treatment, the interventions, the process, the results that we're seeing from the intervention or throughout the process. When writing a clinical case study, we tend to demonstrate how theories apply in kind of real world practice. We provide models for clinicians to see and get a little bit of a lived experience of the work that we're doing. We share innovations and the techniques to provide examples of how to replicate the things that we're doing in sessions with clients. They also tend to be written in more of a engaging narrative style, as opposed to more empirical research writing that we tend to see in more academic journals. And one other thing that for me I think is key for clinical case studies is that they're more accessible to practicing clinicians. We get really exposed to the insights of their phenomenological world, even if they're not phenomenologists and they're working from that perspective. We're getting kind of a real world insight as to what's happening behind those doors in a counseling session.
There's a place in academic journals for a particular type of clinical case study, and that would be considered a descriptive dialogic case study. I think that's taken from Lukoff, 98. The descriptive dialogic case study uses theory and is guided by theory, and it is, like Dr. Rodriguez identified, it is a narrative storytelling format with a tremendous amount of good case example, transcription-based example. There's value in this even in academic settings, and because it's also another opportunity to bring it into counselor education. These are things that are accessible for students, can be incorporated more readily into the classroom, and I think we have a responsibility to kind of build a repository of these in a way that's fairly accessible for academics, so that it can be great exposure for graduate students.
Yeah, so I think that so in most counseling spaces, staffing is happening, right? Whether we call it staffing or whether we call it supervision, right? Where we are presenting on clinical cases just in a verbal format. And so I think that just having it written up in a clinical case study is taking what we are already kind of doing amongst our colleagues, hopefully doing to help support our novice counselors, but making sure it's reaching more than just the people in our offices, but kind of a broader counseling community. So I would love to hear what Dr. Rodriguez and Dr. Wilkinson have to say about this also, because I think that we are doing this verbally, but I don't think that we are doing it in a concise written format and have a repository, as they said earlier, to make sure that we can go back and keep track of these cases.
Yeah, and I'm trying to think about how we use them, when we use them in our education and training, and where is it lacking and how we can do more of it, and kind of the why. Like the why is coming up for me as to how we choose to use case studies, and I'm always torn between this like assessment and evaluation process and the like phenomenology that happens between two people. And I think as educators, as counselor educators, at times we will get kind of wrapped up and stuck in the evaluation and assessment process, and it's kind of on our forefront. And understandably so, it's important. We're always kind of thinking about like, how are we measuring this? How are we grading students? How are we teaching? And how do I know the outcomes of what I'm teaching? And sometimes I think that takes us away from like the experience.
I'll say that just as one example, I teach a child and adolescent class, and I teach Violet Oaklander's Windows to Our Children. And that book is wonderful on so many levels, but primarily she provides really good case examples consistently. And students say, I love this. I appreciate seeing what she's doing in the room in real time. They aren't all exactly verbatim transcriptions. Many of them are done after the fact, but it gives a student a sense of being there, and it demystifies the process in a meaningful way. So students feel closer to the process and they say, this makes sense, right? And so that's one example. I also think that we are doing this when we do supervision, but the supervision process is often, say you take 15 minutes to do a case consult, it's happening quick. It's happening in real time, real quick. There's not a depth examination where you can look at the nuance of a particular phrasing like you can when it's on paper. when you have, say, a transcribed section on paper and a detail and the background and the history, and you can refer to it, and then put students into small groups and have them process in detail what they might do differently, or what they agree with, what they don't agree with, what were alternative options. When you have it on paper, you can do that.
So, empirical case studies are qualitative, quantitative, or mixed method kind of research studies. And we have kind of three primary scholars that we kind of rest our case study, empirical case study models on. So, we have Yin, who has a very positivistic perspective that there is truth or not truth. And we are searching for truth here. And typically, Yin's case study models are really, really good program evaluation. They tend to rely mostly on quantitative data. They tend to be very well structured. And so if you have kind of a funding mechanism that's requiring you to have a very explicit protocol before you begin, then doing kind of a Yinian style case study is probably what you're going to be resting on there. Then kind of a little further down the line, we have Miriam's case study model. And Miriam is actually very interesting because Miriam's case studies were based on doing case studies in educational settings. Miriam realized very early on in her career that we cannot just study students in a classroom without studying the classroom as a whole. We can't just study if an intervention works in a classroom without understanding the context surrounding it, without understanding the community, the students in it. And so Miriam's case study model actually is an excellent space for counselor educators, and I think for counselors, especially if we want to understand phenomenon around group counseling, or if we want to understand not just the individual experience with a client, but is our entire counseling department or counseling unit or division, how are we functioning as that is the bounds of the case? And then we have Stake, who kind of came in and said, you know what, like, case study is really about intuition. I'm going to have my own understanding of the data. My participants are going to have their own understanding of the data. And then the reader is going to have their own understanding of the data. There is no possible way we can be seeking truth here because everybody's going to interpret this in wildly different ways. So Stake came in with this existential constructivist perspective of case study that we should be collecting data and analyzing data at the same time, that maybe the boundaries aren't as clear, that as I'm moving through my data collection, I might be like, oh, actually, I think I want to collect this from my person also. So the protocol from Stake's perspective cannot be laid out before we start our investigation. It kind of unfolds as I get to know my case. And I want to put a caveat around stakes because I think for novice researchers, they're like, oh yeah, that sounds really awesome. But I would caution that not having kind of using researcher intuition to guide your study is really something that comes after you have a really deep understanding of case study and a really deep understanding of this methodology. Um, and so the kind of empirical case study, the key part is just having bounds around your case. So we are studying things with boundaries. So I am potentially studying a client, or I'm studying the relationship between me and the client, or I'm studying a classroom or a school or a teacher, right? Like, so we have clear boundaries around what is our case, and then we're collecting multiple data points within that case. So that could be measures like the Beck depression inventory, the Beck anxiety inventory. It could be my clinical notes. It could be the client's phrasing in session. It could be the number of sessions they attend, right? Like, it could be our data is as expansive as the case can be. And so empirical case study is really amazing when we want to study something within the context of it. So from the empirical side, there's tons and tons of literature on how to organize that information. Stake's book on multiple case studies even gives you worksheets that you fill out for each different component to kind of walk you through how you get from collecting, organizing data to your assumptions and your assertions. Miriam also has a really detailed book on what kind of data you can be collecting, different examples on analysis methods. I think that's one of the interesting things for me as a researcher about case study is that I'm not just doing one analysis method. I am having to do a different analysis method for every data point, because if I collect a song from my client, that is going to be analyzed different than the PHQ-9 score from my client. And so there's just so much you can do from the researcher side. The jump from a clinical case study to an empirical case study is actually not as wide, I think, as most clinicians would realize. I think a lot of the rigor of the empirical case study we already do in the counseling room, right? We do a very strong intake where we get a deep dive into the background of the client. We're already tracking progress with goals and objectives in our treatment plans. We're already utilizing assessment measures, whether that's the PHQ-9 or any of the Beck inventories, right? Like there's a wide amount of data that we're using already to inform our clinical practice, to inform when a client has met their goals and is ready to be discharged or transitioned out to different types of care. And so all of that is the rigor that is happening in our counseling rooms translates to the rigor that we just need to put on paper. Um, and so I think this is not a very far jump to get from kind of a clinical case study into an empirical case study realm. And I hope clinicians hear that and truly see that, because we would love to hear their voice. They really, truly are seeing trends. They're seeing different variations of presentations of clinical diagnoses. They're seeing such a wide range of things in their counseling sessions that we need to have this feedback loop to the rest of the counseling community, to students, to educators, to make sure that we're training well.
Yeah, so the empirical and the clinical are not too wide apart, but we will also say that on the clinical side, as Dr. Az noted, there's more kind of a structure that you ensure around it. I think that there can be a bit more spontaneity in the process of developing a clinical case study because the emphasis is so descriptive. It's so descriptive. And so a clinician will recognize that they have a good case study when they are fascinated or have an aha moment and say, I wish I could share this really incredibly interesting experience I had with this client, this particularly dynamic client, this dynamic moment, this dynamic intervention, that they want to be able to bring that out in some way. And to do that, I think at minimum, there needs to be a general case synopsis, like general background information on the client. There needs to be some form of reflectivity statement or a positionality statement from the counselor themselves. And they need to find some unique way to structure their explanation, whether if it's an intervention that's being introduced, they could provide background on that. There needs to be transcription, though. I feel very strongly on the clinical side, like transcription is the heart of it. And so finding a way to develop a strong transcription is very important. But I think there's a lot of flexibility built into the clinical, and I think that there's a lot of opportunity to find creative ways to uh, set up the case and to tell the story, right? Because it doesn't need to be dry; it can be a storytelling. I think that's true on the empirical side as much as the clinical. Good storytelling resonates with people, and we need to be able to share these stories more broadly.
From the ethical lens, I would add, when writing a case study or crafting one, to really be thinking about protecting confidentiality, changing, identifying details as much as possible if this is coming from a live situation you've been in, and like Dr. Wilkinson mentioned around transcription, if you're using actual client dialogue, being sure to just to de-identify or distort any potential identifying aspects, but while also maintaining the creativity and the meaning behind what you're trying to share with your audience. And just ensuring that it has educational value rather than like self-serving purposes. And like what are you trying to teach and demonstrate to clinicians and practitioners who are picking up your case or your study?
I think if we look at the history of the developments in counseling and psychotherapy, we started with case-based research. And over time, we have slowly and steadily moved towards sample-based research. And that's great in a lot of ways. But I think that the abandonment of case-based research is a real problem. When we, and particularly in a field like ours, I mean, we're counselor educators. We're training counselors on a day-to-day basis to go out in the field, and yet we're focusing so much of our research on sample-based without actually looking about what's happening in terms of process and outcomes in the room, or particularly process in the room and the nuance of that process. So I think that there has been for a very long time a movement towards sample-based research, quantitative style research, and standard qualitative research with larger samples. And I think that it's about time that we move back towards case-based. And there has been a little shift there. In the last 7 years, we have seen a significant uptick in case-based submissions to journals. And that includes Journal of Humanistic Counseling, as well as Journal of Counseling and Development and some others. But in most journals, we're not getting any. And so there has been a shift since about 2015 when we look at the stats, an increase there. And we need more of that because we all benefit when we can speak to the actual experiences we have as counselors in the room. So as the editor of the Journal of Humanistic Counseling, when I came on in July, I reorganized the submission categories and created a case study submission category. And I think it can be generally understood that we're looking for empirical case studies. But I think we can also look for high quality clinical case studies. And I want to explain in part why. I think that a lot of the conversation we have in counselor education, for good reason, is around rigor. And I also think that excessive emphasis on rigor in a field such as ours tends to alienate practitioners in the field, practitioners who are deeply embedded in their day-to-day work with clients, and they don't feel like they're part of the conversation. And I think that what Counseling Today is doing by bringing case studies into the magazine is an opportunity to create accessibility. I think that at a journal-based level too, we have an opportunity to engage clinicians, counselors in a more direct way. I'd like to be able to invite counselors in the field to submit their ideas and not to feel like they have to be trapped within the confines of academic level research rigor. I think that clinical case studies, whether it be descriptive, exploratory descriptive, or a descriptive dialogic, whether it's theory driven or whether it's just really clearly descriptive work with good case illustrations, I think it provides an opportunity for us to reach out and create a more egalitarian space and to move away from sort of the ivory tower separation from the people that we work with on a day-to-day basis, the students we train who go out into the field and don't necessarily feel like they have a voice or feel connected. I believe that case studies can serve as a bridge. And I believe that if we do it well, that we can maintain a very high level of quality in clinical case studies that could be admissible at journals as well as within something like Counseling Today. I also want to be clear that in general, case studies require fewer references to the literature than, say, a conceptual study or a practice-based article. They also can be a bit shorter in form. So we're very flexible with what this can look like, and we're very excited for people to start submitting.
I would argue that we have really struggled as a field to kind of uniquely create theory that is grounded in counseling. And I wonder if it's because we've wandered so far away from our exemplar cases that this really truly is a way to capture what uniquely are professional counselors doing in this space. What are our kind of strengths-based components doing? How are we looking at our clients from a holistic viewpoint, right? Like how uniquely as a profession are we conceptualizing and working with clients? And I think case study is a beautiful way for us to capture as a profession kind of uniquely what our contribution is to the mental health field and what we're doing with our clients. So I absolutely agree. I hope that clinical case studies are informing the research that we're doing. And I think that there are many educators that do not have active caseloads because for some of our academic positions, that is not a requirement of our job. And so some of the richness in the classroom classroom that I have been able to bring is that I still see clients. And so when I'm teaching about depression, I'm bringing in a clinical case that I saw last week of a client that meets criteria for depression to really like help my students see what the DSM looks like when it comes live in the room. And I hope that that is what case study does for our profession is it gives a tool also to counselor educators that may not have an active caseload to be able to bring clients into their classrooms for students to actually work with.